Hello, everybody, and welcome back to episode number 5 in this series. It's team number 28 in my power rankings. That math works out. I don't know. It's been a long day. We're talking about the Philadelphia Flyers today, and the Flyers are an interesting team because they started off so hot at the start of the season, and they really looked like they were going to make the playoffs for a long time. And then they kind of fell into that group with like the Islanders and the Penguins and the Capitals that were, and I guess Buffalo too for a little bit, where these teams just were kind of fighting to not make the playoffs. New Jersey was kind of in there too, where like every team went like below 500 for the end of the season pretty much. And the teams that didn't really weren't great. I mean, Washington made the playoffs with a negative goal differential. It was this really weird group of teams from like 8 to like 11 and 12 in the East last year, and Philly was right in the middle of that. And they really started off extremely hot, and they really had things going and working for them. And then the Carter Hart thing happened, and that really deteriorated them a little bit. But I really think this season, more than anything, showed how much John Tortorella has improved from where he was a couple of jobs ago. And he's one of those few coaches that I think has shown an ability to adapt and kind of grow as a head coach. And last year in Philadelphia really proved that to me. And it's something to kind of watch for. We'll see if he can catch lightning in a bottle again and elevate this team to another level. I don't know. I mean, obviously this is mostly based on the roster. It's obviously coaching has a bit of a factor into the overall ranking, but on paper, like, this Flyers team isn't really close to being a top end team in the NHL, at least not yet. But I think the coaching could elevate them again, and I just kind of wanted to throw that out there at the beginning of this because John Tortorella really kind of proved to me last season that he is able to really kind of change his coaching philosophy and really kind of make something a bit better. Moving into the offseason moves, though, forward group, Matvei Michkov is really the only player at all that Philly is adding to this roster. They lose Dennis Gurianov and Cam Atkinson. There's not really much there. It's obviously an upgrade. Matvei Michkov is going to be phenomenal. Everybody's kind of talked about him already, and everybody kind of knows what they're going to get in him. He's an electric player. He's going to be a top-end offensive producer, or at least he projects to be. He's somebody I was super high on. He was my second player on my draft board last year, and I think he was, like, at least I think he was closer to Bedard than he was to 3. I'm super high on Matvei Michkov. I think he rocks, and I do have some concerns about him, but we'll get into that more when I talk about the offense more in depth. Defensively, this team loses Mark Stahl. They don't add anything. Mark Stahl is just kind of a guy at this point. It's a wash. And then goalies, if you're considering Carter Hart to be a loss in the offseason, obviously it's a downgrade. But if you consider him to be a loss during the season, then technically they didn't lose anybody. And yeah, it's been a pretty quiet offseason for the Flyers overall. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. But now let's dive more into their roster in depth. So the Philadelphia Flyers rank 30th for me offensively, and very similar to a lot of these teams at the bottom half of this ranking. A lot of that has to do with the fact that this team is very prospect driven and very young player driven and development driven. So I'm not really going out of my way to say that it's a bad team. I just think they need to develop and they need to prove that they can be better NHL players. Obviously at the top of this, Travis Konechny, who just signed an extension, he rocks. Like, Travis Konechny is awesome. And although I think the extension might be a little rich and kind of proves why teams should lock up their superstars early rather than signing them to these bridge deals that walk them to UFA status, Travis Konechny is still a very, very effective hockey player. And his ability to really kind of to drive play and be a good two-way forward and create offense as well is very underrated. And I think a lot of that, the reason for that is because he was playing on a team that didn't make the playoffs and people didn't really see him in a spotlight. And even for non-playoff teams, I mean, Philly doesn't get a ton of national coverage, at least as much as they used to. Not as much as like a regular, an original 16 would. Like, I mean, Chicago got a ton of media coverage because Bedard. Philly doesn't really have that. I think they'll get that a little bit with Michkov this year. And I think that could really kind of showcase Travis Konechny more than maybe the average viewer gives him credit for. Sean Couturier is kind of an interesting one for me. If he can try to get back some of the game he had a couple of years ago before the injury, he could still be a super effective player. I just need to see it more than the glimpses we saw last year. And I mean, Matvei Michkov is really the centerpiece of this offense right now. And for me, I mean, Michkov's my Calder pick, and I think he's the front runner for a lot of people. The one concern I have, though, and of course, like I'm very adamant on the fact that there's no such thing as a bust-proof prospect. Like, everybody can be ruined with the right situation. For me, the biggest concern is John Tortorella. And as much as Tortorella proved last year that he can let players just kind of play, a lot of the players that he let kind of just go also had that defensive game to their arsenal as well. And at least now, like, I don't think Michkov has that in the same level as like a Travis Konechny or an Owen Tippett does. And that kind of concerns me. And I really hope that Tortorella can not limit Michkov's offensive ability and can just kind of let him go and surround him with pieces that can make up for that deficiency that's going to be there at the start of his career, at least. That's my biggest concern. Other than that, though, I mean, like, if he's able to let go, I think, you know, Frost and Tippett are very solid line mates for him. I mean, Owen Tippett kind of has that ability to cover up a lot of his mistakes, and Morgan Frost can as well. And I mean, Morgan Frost would get a huge boost from playing with somebody like Michkov. I mean, his career trajectory would just shoot up, and his development would go crazy too. I think just playing with a player like that obviously is going to benefit anybody, but I think it could be a really real beneficial to somebody like Morgan Frost. Depth-wise, like, I like this team. Joel Farabee, Scott Laughton, and Bobby Brink is a solid third line. I'm assuming Flyers fans are going to think I'm low on Brink at a D. I just didn't see enough, aside from the point totals, to give him a higher grade, although I think that game will come. I have no concern about Bobby Brink as a player long term. Like, I think he's going to be very good. He just played 50-some games and didn't have outstanding underlying numbers, and it was like about half a point a game anyway. So, yeah, I just need to see more from Bobby Brink to grade him higher. But I mean, like, I'm not saying that he's going to be a bad player in any stretch of the word. I don't think that's the case. And then, like, you have guys like Noah Cates on the fourth line here, who's one of the best defensive players in the league last year. You have Ryan Poehling, who's proved that he can be a good depth option. Garnet Hathaway, again, another guy that brings that veteran presence, that brings experience, but also it's just somebody you can throw out and feel confident, you know, putting out on the ice and knowing you're not going to just let up a bunch of chances. And that's really what this bottom six does for me, is they're all very safe, might not be the right word, but they're very consistent players. I mean, like, Joel Farabee is just, he's an embodiment of, like, your typical third line winger that you'd want, where you can just put him out and you know kind of what you're going to get from Joel Farabee every time you put him out there. Same with, like, a Scott Laughton and everybody really on this bottom six. And I think that's really kind of the thing I really like about this Flyers core. Although I don't know if the talent is quite there yet, the consistency is there, and this team plays very similarly game to game. There isn't a lot of fluctuation, at least offensively, with this team. This you kind of know, I can look at this roster up and down, and I can give you a pretty solid guess of what you're going to get from each of these players every single night. I think that speaks a lot to how John Tortorella runs his teams, and that's something that we've seen in John Tortorella coach teams for a while now. And I think it really is going to help the development of this Flyers team long term. Now, again, I think there is a concern that harp on consistency and, playing the game the same way, game in and game out, could hurt somebody like a Matvei Michkov, who needs to be kind of just let loose and given the ability to just do whatever he needs to do to create offense. And if Tortorella can kind of find a balance between that and running his system the way he did last year, this Flyers team could be kind of surprising this season. Like, I think this offense could surprise some people and take a big jump, and maybe not individually. You may not see a ton of grade boosts at the end of the year, but I think as a whole, the unit could take a big jump and could keep this team in a lot of games. So I'm very excited to kind of see how Tortorella handles somebody like Michkov. I think that's easily the most interesting story on this team. But overall, I think there's a bunch of pieces here I really like. And I'm very excited to see how year 2 under this regime, really the year 2 of this regime, goes, and see if they can take another big step, because last year was a good season for them. And despite how poorly the last third of it went, I think Flyers fans can look at last year and consider it an overall success. And I wouldn't be shocked if they have a similar season this year to what they did last season. Defensively is kind of a similar story to the offense. It's very much trying to get consistency out of these players. And I think whereas the offense last year showed that they could do that, I think defensively this kind of has to be the year that happens. This defense is led by Travis Sanheim, who, if you followed me at all over the last little bit, know that I absolutely love Travis Sanheim. Him and Konechny are two of my favorite players in the league. And again, it's just kind of one of those unsung guys who doesn't get a ton of attention because he's not putting up 80 points a season, but just really does all the little things very well as a defenseman. And he's very much that guy that coaches are going to love, and all the stat guys are going to love too, because he has all those numbers. He has all those things that people look for in a defenseman like that. And it really does help this defense to have kind of an anchor like a Travis Sanheim on this blue line. I highlighted Jamie Drysdale here because the Cutter Gauthier Jamie Drysdale trade, I think it's going to be one of those ones that's going to be talked about for a while, and obviously Philly didn't have much of a choice but to trade Cutter Gauthier. And Jamie Drysdale did kind of step up once he went to Philly, and we saw some growth in his game, and he seemed more confident. He looked like he was putting in more consistent showings game in and game out, whereas in Anaheim, he really couldn't find that spot in the lineup. He couldn't seem to get comfortable in his role. And I think in the brief time we saw him in Philly, we kind of did see him feel better and look a lot more comfortable playing in Philly. So I'm interested to see if that can continue, or if that was just a flash in the pan, and we'll see if that can happen again. Cam York's a similar player where it took him a couple years to really grow into that full-time NHL defenseman role. And last year was kind of his breakout as that player, as a true full-time NHLer. And he had a solid season. And for a lot of Flyers fans, they took a sigh of relief right there, because obviously you're watching Cole Caulfield do what he is in Montreal. And even though Caulfield hasn't been completely the player that a lot of Canadiens fans thought he might be, he's definitely been better than Cam York. And that's kind of the battle that, Flyers fans have been like, well, we should have took Caulfield. And Cam York put a bit of those criticisms to rest last season. He definitely looked a lot more like a true top 4 NHL defenseman. And again, I think in big moments, and if he does end up playing with Travis Sanheim this year, as Daily Faceoff projects, having a guy like that who's just so good at everything should really help a young defenseman feel confident to take more risks and not be afraid to make a ton of mistakes, because he has that backing of a very solid defenseman beside him. As for the rest of this team, Nick Seeler, again, I think is the guy who's kind of underrated and fits that second line pretty well. And again, I think similar to Sanheim for Cam York, I think Nick Seeler is kind of like a worse version of that for Jamie Drysdale, who right now is a worse version of Cam York. So the top four works for me. Rasmus Ristolainen actually had like a okay season last season. Obviously nowhere near the contract that he's making, but it was a fine season. Like, he wasn't one of the worst defensemen in the NHL last year, which he was consistently in Buffalo. So that's a positive, I guess. You're starting to get a little bit of value out of that contract. And if they throw him on their third line, he's somebody that you can feel okay with putting out on the ice. It's not a Jack Johnson or Eric Branson situation like Columbus has, right? Like, you can throw Rasmus Ristolainen out there and know you're probably not going to give up like a bunch of high grade scoring chances against like instantly. So overall, like, I think there's room for development here. Cam York and Jamie Drysdale are obviously kind of like the two big pieces that Flyers fans are going to be looking at to see another jump in. And obviously Cam York took a big step last year. Jamie Drysdale looked a lot more comfortable in the few games he played in Philly. So both those guys are kind of my two main focal points to watch for the Flyers this season. But yeah, I think this defense could improve. And so similar to a lot of these young defensive cores, like, it's going to take time, especially with blue lines. It takes a lot of time. You have kind of your safety nets in Sanheim and Seeler. I would like to see them bring in, if they can, a bit more reliable defenseman over Rasmus Ristolainen as kind of that third pillar on this team. But like, the framework is there for this to become a solid defensive core, and you just kind of got to hope that your young guys peak at the same time that your veterans are still kind of in their prime or just exiting their prime. So that's kind of the challenge at this point for Philly. Finally move on to the goalies, and this tandem ranks 30th. Samuel Erson's going to be the starter, and I think they just kind of run a tandem rotation for the backup for now. This is really a team that, I mean, I've fantasy booked James Reimer to a bunch of teams already in this series, and this is another one of the teams that a flyer on James Reimer seemed like a good decision. And you could still run a tandem, but at least you'd have that backup that's solid. Obviously Erson, the situation he got thrown into last year was like insane, and he played as well as you could have expected him to through it, right? Like, instantly becoming the starter with zero safety net like halfway through the season is wild. And especially when your team was as good as Philly was at that time. And he played about as well as you could have expected. And I give him credit for that. Now, do I think that he develops into like a top 10 starter this season? No, but I think there was a lot of bright spots in that for the Flyers, and obviously there's shaky moments as well, which is why he's a C-. And there's just not enough track record for me to really put him higher than that. But I do have faith in him to be in that, maybe high C tier, CC plus kind of tier by the end of the season. Backup wise, maybe one of the guys that they have steps up and takes that spot, but right now there really isn't anything. I just had to randomly pick somebody. Fedotov's the guy that Daily Faceoff has as the backup right now. So there you go. But yeah, it's just, we'll see. It's kind of a crapshoot in the backup goalie position for Philly. But goalies are always a crapshoot, so take that with what you will. This isn't really there. Like, Carter Hart leaving isn't Philly's fault, but not getting a safety net for Erson is. So, I have to judge them based on what the team is right now, and this is what it is. And I think Erson's fine as your starter. Let's see what he can do. Throw him in the fire, and they're really going to throw him into the fire again this season. So we'll see. Yeah, so that's my take on the Flyers. Overall, like, I think this team, I I guess they got better because they added Michkov. They really didn't do much. Like, that's it, right? Like, it was a pretty quiet offseason for the Flyers and for, you know, a front off for Daniel Brière's front office that's had a couple crazy off seasons, like the last couple seasons. That's kind of okay, right? And obviously Daniel Brière wasn't there for like the Ristolainen trade and the Ryan Ellis move and all that, but Philly's kind of had these crazy swing off seasons the last couple seasons, and this was just very much a quiet, let's see what happens off season, and I don't think that's a bad thing. So we'll see. They're an interesting team. I'm intrigued to see how these young players play. Obviously, Michkov being there makes them a draw and makes them a team you should absolutely tune in to watch, because if he can do what he was doing in the KHL and if he can be the guy that people project him to be, he's going to be so much fun, and he's going to be a highlight reel player that he's going to sell tickets like crazy. But yeah, so let me know what you guys think about the Philadelphia Flyers, and we'll see you in the next video. Thank you for watching. Make sure you like, comment down below, and subscribe, and follow me on Instagram as well, because I post more content on there, and you'll just get more like life updates and updates about this series and stuff on there as well. So I also have a couple big things planned for this series. I got some very cool stuff lined up for some episodes later down the line. So stay tuned for that. And yeah, thank you for watching. Thank you for enjoying the series, and we'll see you in the next one.